Hello, Canada and the world. Kevin J. Johnston here, freedomreport.ca. We had a great video a couple of weeks ago with Dan Murray from immigrationwatchcanada.org, and the questions from around the country just poured in. I had to spend quite a bit of time to sift through them, and I have found the best ones to ask. I have Dan Murray on the phone with me right now. Dan, how's everything?
Just fine, Kevin.
I appreciate you taking the time again. This is wonderful. Let's get right into it. We have 3 immigration-focused federal studies, and what we'll do, because we're probably going to have lengthy answers on these, we will break them down and make this a 3-part video, if that's okay with you.
That's fine with me.
Wonderful. So question number 1 here is, you mentioned previously that you're going to tell the country about the 3 important federal government commissioned immigration studies, which many Canadians know nothing about. So you want to go ahead with that? I'd love to hear it.
Of course, yeah. And I would say that the Canadians who know the least about these studies are those in our federal government, namely our Prime Minister, Trudeau, his entire cabinet, most, if not all, MPs, and most, if not all, senators. And in addition, I'd include almost all provincial and municipal politicians in Canada, and I'd also say that many politicians commonly give 3 reasons to justify high immigration. But these 3 key studies contradict the reasons that our politicians give. And very, very quickly, the 3 reasons are the following. Number 1, Canada has lots of room for more people. 2, Canada has an aging population. And 3, Canada's economy needs immigrants.
Okay. Obviously, yeah, it's a big country, but almost all of us live within 100 kilometers of the American border.
Yes.
I've been to Sudbury and James Bay and Hudson's Bay in the wintertime. I can't imagine why anybody who would come in from a desert-like or hot country want to live there. So it's a big piece of land, but where are people going to go that they're going to feel comfortable? So that's one of the issues that I take here. Now, your statement's quite damning, and another question that we've got is, you're saying that the Prime Minister and thousands of other politicians, which you've said on many different occasions on your website, they don't know the basics about immigration. What do you have to say on that?
Well, if you want proof, you just have to listen to Trudeau on many occasions, and whenever the topic of immigration comes up, he says something that's quite ridiculous. And, he claims to be operating a evidence-based government, but everything that he says about immigration is not evidence-based. It's ideologically based or diversity-based.
Well, I've yet to hear him make any kind of intelligent argument at all, either for or against immigration, aside from the fact that we need to help Syrians. And that's really all he says. Now, we really only have 10 major cities in this country that are worth calling major cities. And I noticed that we're not spreading immigrants around. He's bringing in refugees and not spreading them around. Do you think that we'd have less of a problem if we were to spread them around to all 10 cities and maybe even exclude Toronto and Montreal in that list?
Well, the one big problem that the immigration lobby is going to present is that the charter says that people can move around the country whenever they want to. So if Canada were to introduce a measure like that, the immigration lobby would be after the government and taking them as far as they could go, to overturn those kind of measures.
Instead of trying to I guess, be rude about it, is there any way to change the marketing campaign stating that lovely Saskatoon now has a professional lacrosse team? It's a major city. Let's put you there. Is there any advantage to something like that? Ad campaigns for different cities.
Well, the point is, that when you bring more and more people in, what you're doing is you're taking the pie and you're dividing it up into more and more pieces, and the pieces get smaller and smaller, the more people you bring in. And what the Science Council was pointing out was that there's a limit, to the size of that pie. And,
yeah. Okay, so I remember you did mention you want to make a quick statement on that. We'll go straight to study number 1, which is the Science Council of Canada report. I understand you had a small piece to say on that before I ask you any questions, so you go ahead.
Well, the key thing about this study and all of the other studies is that they were actually, commissioned by the federal government. So it wasn't as if, a bunch of politicians were meeting in the bar, after, a day in Parliament or the provincial legislature or the municipal council. These were people who knew a lot about these topics, and they put their knowledge to use, and they came up with these studies and all the recommendations that are in the studies.
Well, how long did that go on for?
Well, the 3 studies went on for, they were done over a period of 15 years, starting in 1976 and going up to about 1990. And again, the politicians who like to twist information in order to get ethnic groups to vote for them were not involved. And the Science Council, for example, consisted of the best scientists in the country. That council existed for over 25 years, between 1966 and 1993 to be exact. Mm-hmm. And its job was to provide scientific evidence for government policy, and that's what they did. So if for example, our liberal government, our current liberal government, believes that government decisions should be based on evidence, here's the evidence for them.
So a 25-year study is done. We provide all the evidence in the world, and seemingly now it's all being ignored. So I guess really the question would be, what immigration-related advice was given to the federal government on this? There's something wrong, not with what you're saying. There's just something wrong with the pragmatism of what you're saying here. This study is there. It doesn't seem to be in practice.
Yes, yeah, you're right in saying that the studies are completely ignored. In fact, just before Barbara McDougall made her notorious announcement that her government was going to increase immigration levels to 250,000 per year, these studies were on her. Let's put it this way: they should have been on her desk. The government had just been handed the studies, in the previous 2 years, and she should have been aware of them. So she ignored them, and we have the disastrous result that has followed, ignoring them or suppressing them. And there's probably a combination of ignorance on her part and suppression on her part too.
Okay, there's a question that I've got here, which actually relates to what you just said, and it's a long one, so I'm going to condense what's been printed for me here. It's to cap or to stabilize a population. So when developers in the real estate industry are working on things, do they love or do they hate mass amounts of immigration?
They love it. In fact, they're the ones that are behind the whole movement to increase immigration levels, or at the very least to maintain what we're taking already.
Okay.
And the point is, we don't need what we're taking already, and we definitely don't need to have an increase in those levels.
One of the conversations, and I'll never quite forget this one, it was back in 1994, and I was publishing comic books of all things at the time. I was speaking to an economist who had indicated to me that the reason that Canadians don't do well selling their books and selling their wares within the country is that Canada needs another 100 million people within it to make itself a stable economic power in the world.
Yeah.
So it looks like we're going there, but it's not going to be 100 million Canadian-born people. It's going to be probably the better part of 70 million immigrants.
Yes, yeah.
I can't see that working. I can't see, especially with this push for diversity or this push for multiculturalism, I can't see that being 100 million loyal nationalist Canadians buying Canadian products from Canadians. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah. Well, when the Science Council did its study, the phrase I think that was used by the government minister who actually made the request, the formal request to the Science Council, was that he wanted to find out on behalf of the federal government what would be an optimum population for Canada. And the Science Council told him and the rest of the government that Canada's population was growing too fast, and that Canada had to restrict immigration and work towards stabilizing its population. And indirectly, it said that Canada should cap its population at around 34 million. Well, we're already past that.
Right.
That particular statement is, it's quite a revolutionary statement, because I don't think if you went around the world, you would see too many countries who have made who've made statements like that. So
you're talking statements about.
But it's
sorry, so
really important.
Dan, you're talking about making statements about capping a population. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not a common thing around the world.
No, not at all. In fact, most countries, are in danger, environmentally and economically, and especially, of destroying themselves. Just committing outright suicide because they're letting their population get way out of control.
Oh boy! All right, let me ask you this then: what evidence did the Science Council have when they presented that information of a cap of 34 million?
Well, they had lots. Now, the first thing that they did was say that Canada had to deal with a big misconception about itself, and the misconception was that Canada was empty, or that it had lots of room. Today, almost 40 years after the Science Council declared that it was foolish to say that Canada was empty, many politicians still tell Canadians that Canada has lots of room for more people. So here's one of the statements that was put into the Science Council of Canada report. It said, "Geographical size does not count for much when so much of your country is desert and rock swept by winter's wind." Now, that's a direct quotation. I think it's quite poetic,
yeah,
as well as being really accurate.
It's extremely accurate.
So, in other words, most of Canada has a hostile climate. It was not suitable for human settlement. It is not suitable for human settlement now, and it never has been. So not many people have ever lived in many parts of Canada, and not many ever will, for good reasons. So Canada, in other words, Canada should not have an open-door immigration policy and should not be taking large numbers of immigrants. In fact, it should restrict immigration and the continued growth of its population. And once again, I say, they're saying Canada should cap its population. Now, if you want me to go on to some evidence, I can give you the evidence right now.
Well, yeah, let's do that. What else did the Science Council have to say? Let's hear it. I'd like to hear that. Very much so.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things it said was that Canada had to achieve food security. So in order to do that, it had to protect its very limited amount of agricultural land from being built upon.
Okay, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
I'm very familiar, for example, in southern Ontario, if you look at how much it's exploded from a building standpoint, I know that the original plan for the province of Ontario was to have residential and business areas follow Lake Ontario. And for everybody around the world, I'd like you to look at the map starting in the city of Hamilton, Ontario, and work it all the way across to the city of Cornwall, Ontario. It was supposed to be all habitation there by the lake and the St. Lawrence River, and everything north of Toronto, by about 25 k's north of it, was supposed to be relegated to farmland only. And then what happened is, and I don't know the exact year, but I remember being a kid when this happened, a major amusement park opened up called Canada's Wonderland. And that took over 96 acres, I think it was. And then with the parking lot, it was over 300 acres of farmland to have that amusement park in there. And now, if you look at it, all that farmland, which is the perfect growing land and the perfect temperatures, winter and spring and summer to grow, is all malls, roads, and townhouses.
Yes. Yeah.
So we have literally sold off and built on the most productive land in Ontario
Yes.
because of an amusement park and because the original plan wasn't followed. So Ontario, from the standpoint of growing, I think we're going to be importing everything from California in the future. I don't think there's going to be an awful lot of Ontario grown produce, aside from a very select few areas.
Yes. Yeah. The big problem with food security, period, is that Canada, as you say, is relying on the United States in particular for food products. But those areas where we're getting our food from, California and Florida in particular,
Yep.
are having are going to have major problems. In California, they've had a drought going on for many, many years, and
their reservoirs are low.
Yeah, they're very, very low. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they rely on irrigation, to grow those crops, and if there's no water, you're not going to have any crops, and you're not going to have any food to export. So if you build over, your best farmland, and Southern Ontario had the best climate, for farming in all of Canada.
It did, yeah. I've looked at the studies on that, and there's a reason why. The Niagara region, Niagara Falls region, Stony Creek, St. Catharines, Grimsby, Fruitland, Vineland, all those towns there. There's a reason why there are so many incredible vineyards there, and why Ontario has so many incredible wines that are actually produced within the Niagara Falls area.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way that the westerlies winds prevail, they go and they hit Buffalo, but they miss us. So the further south you go in this area, the worse the weather would be. It's perfect. And if you start building on top of all that, we lose the best weather conditions in the country to grow grapes, or to grow fruit in general, because it's not just grapes that are being grown. There are many fruit wines that are being grown there too.
Yes, yeah. The Science Council of Canada cited one particular figure. It said that even though Canada had quite a large land area, only about 13% of Canada's land area is capable of some kind of agricultural production.
Whoa,
and,
only 13.
Only half of that 13, that is only about 6%, is capable of production of common field crops. So we're talking about a small amount of land, that we've got in order, to provide us with, the vegetable crops that we need to feed our own population. But the development and the real estate industry and the immigration industry have basically run the show in Canada on this particular topic, and they've done all they can to suppress whatever the Science Council of Canada did, or whatever other agencies have said about this mad growth that's going on.
So, with other countries out there, even the United States, they've got populations that are literally exploding, and at the same time, those countries, just like us, are losing more and more of their their arable land.
Yes.
Yeah. So, tell us a bit about that. I mean, how concerned do we have to be in North America?
Very concerned. Especially when you have your own prime minister, in the past couple of weeks, saying things like this. I'll quote him. Quote: "Regardless of who you are or where you come from, there's always a place for you in Canada." Unquote. I don't like to use the word stupid, but of all the stupid statements I've heard, from the real estate industry and the immigration lobby, that is one of the dumbest. So he doesn't seem to have any idea at all, of any of the concepts that were in the Science Council of Canada report. So anyway, why don't I mention something besides food security?
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk about energy self-sufficiency?
Yes.
Let's talk about that for sure. Why not?
Well, I think here's a great quote, from the Science Council of Canada. It says, "We need to conserve our own available energy supply. It should be treated as a critical and strategic national resource to be used only when needed." I'll let people digest that. I'll say it once more.
Yeah, please say that again, because I want to digest that too.
Yeah. We need to conserve our own available energy supply, period. It should be treated as a critical and strategic national resource to be used only when needed, unquote.
Okay.
In other words, we should not be exporting our energy, and here we're talking about our oil and gas.
Yep.
We should not be exporting our energy as fast as we can extract it from the ground. And why? Well, our cold climate, according to the Science Council of Canada, tells us that we must conserve our own energy supplies for the future needs of our own population. The cold weather is not going to go away. So regardless of what the Science Council said, or ignoring what the Science Council said, you go back to the oil and gas fields and you listen to the premiers and the Prime Minister, they're all trying to get our gas and our oil out of Canada as fast as possible. And this time, it's going to the U.S., but China is going to be looking for some of this gas and some of this oil. And the present government, the Liberal government, is eager to sell it off as fast as possible, ignoring the future needs of the entire country.
Well, I'm also familiar with not just selling our oil resources to China, but the sale of massive amounts of fresh water.
Yes.
Yeah, where they have massive bladder bags that are equally as long as the ships that pull them, and ships are actually pulling these floating bladder bags full of fresh water across the ocean back to China. So we're offloading all of our natural resources for very, very quick gains, but long-term losses.
Yes.
Okay, there's another question here that a gentleman named Jonathan had asked. He's asking here, what do the Science Council say to politicians and others who say that Canada was obligated on humanitarian grounds to take large numbers of immigrants, and particularly those who claim to be refugees? It's actually a very good question.
Yeah. Well, it said that the biggest international contribution Canada can make is to moderate its population growth in order to strengthen its position as an exporter of food.
Okay. So let me just recap that. We need to stabilize a population, not have it grow immensely, stabilize it so that we can produce a lot more food than we need and export that,
yes,
as opposed to importing from the U.S.
Yes, that's
Gotcha.
right.
Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. And it said even with the most generous immigration policies, Canada could accommodate only a tiny fraction of the overpopulation of other countries, as to be insignificant.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Well, then, with you having said that, the left-wingers, the Toronto Star, people like the CBC,
yeah,
they would then look you in the eye and tell you that the science report is out of date.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on that?
Oh,
because
yeah.
It's not, as far as I can tell from what you're saying, it's very much relevant today. In fact, I think it's more relevant today in 2017 than the mid-90s when this thing concluded.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, around 2004 to 2008, Ontario's Environment Commissioner looked at the pressure that immigration-driven population growth was putting on southern Ontario's farmland and water supply. And he also looked at the huge growth in waste from the population. And his conclusion was that unending population growth there, that is in southern Ontario, was not sustainable. In other words, southern Ontario did not have the water supplies to support the increase in population, which was going to be between 4 and 6 million people. And a similar report done by the University of BC said something similar about Metro Vancouver. So the point was that, or the point is, that the Science Council of Canada was not alone. Those two studies, actually there were a couple done by the Ontario Environment Commissioner, but those studies show that the points that were made by the Science Council of Canada were considered to be extremely important, not only in 1976, but up to the present time.
Okay, so the study that was done was obviously done very well by very clever people.
Yes.
And now we have not so clever people, or perhaps just excessively greedy people, either ignoring it or not understanding it. I mean, which do you think it is?
Which do I think it is?
Yeah.
Well.
Or is it a fine balance of both?
No, I'd say it's a balance of both. You know, with regard to the real estate industry, you know, I've got an uncomplimentary phrase that I use to describe them.
Yeah, let me hear it.
All the politicians that are in bed with them, I call them, quote, organized slime, unquote. And they really are some of the worst people you can imagine. You know, they're literally turning most of the metro areas in Canada, you know, the larger metropolitan centers, into environmental disasters. You know, I'd say, you know, that Metro Vancouver really is, you know, to the naked eye, even to the naked eye, you don't have to have a lot of scientific evidence. You just use your eyes and you can see all the destruction that's going on. And you can probably do the same thing in Southern Ontario and another, you know, all the other bigger centers in Canada. You don't need more people in those centers, and
no, we don't.
You even have governments like the city government of Vancouver, you know, claims to be working on making Vancouver into the greenest city in the world. You know, I can't think of anything more ridiculous than a statement like that.
Well, I'll tell you why I think that's a ridiculous statement, because I've been to Vancouver several times, and driving around that city is a nightmare. You know, if you think Montreal's bad,
yeah,
go to Vancouver, and I swear to you, within a day, you're going to want to leave.
Yeah.
And the public transit is great downtown, but that's it. You know, once you get to the airport in the south, or you get to North Vancouver on the water bus,
yes,
which is really just a big ferry boat, on the north side, there's only one street that had a good bus route on the north side of Vancouver. That's it. So how do you have a green city where cars are constantly just sitting there idling?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you've got one bridge, the Lions Gate Bridge, but it's 3 lanes.
Yes.
It's insane. Cars just sit on that bridge idling.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
Yes. Same way for the Second Narrows Bridge. Yeah.
Yeah, unless, of course, our government decides to really get into battery technology and make an affordable $10,000 battery-powered car, which I don't think they're going to do because there's not enough profit in that.
Yeah, but even then, you know, if you're adding millions of people every year, or sorry, I shouldn't say every year, but if you're adding 1 million people every 15 years, you know, you may not have gas-driven vehicles sitting idling on the road. You're going to have these battery-driven vehicles sitting on the road.
Yeah.
So whatever you do, if you've got too many people, you know, you're going to have cars sitting around on the road.
Yeah, and Vancouver can't handle it, honestly. And I know that with our current leadership in the city of Mississauga, we can't handle it. Western Toronto, which you'd call Rexdale and Etobicoke and New Toronto, can't handle it. There's not enough places to expand, and there certainly isn't a strong enough vision for the future. Everybody's in it for a very quick economic gain.
Yeah.
Yeah, very quick.
Yeah, there's a rule of thumb, you know, with regard to you know, the relationship between the number of people who live in an area and the number of cars. So a rough rule of thumb is that if you add two people,
mm-hmm.
whether it be, you know, through interprovincial migration or through immigration, for every 2 people you have an extra car added. And
well, and I'll tell you the truth here, and I make no bones about this. I am not the type of individual that can share a car with somebody. So my wife and I each have our own vehicles. My son will be 16 very shortly and driving very shortly. There'll be a third car there because I don't want to drive a bunch of teenagers around. My daughter will follow a year later. We will be a 4-car family. I've got the driveway space for it, but the city of Mississauga doesn't have the room for another 10,000 families like mine.
yeah,
And I'm telling you this, the transit system here is awful. In the city of Mississauga, if anyone looks at a map, look at the mall called Meadowvale Town Center. I'll let you guys do that on your own. I won't animate this. From that mall to a mall in the south central part of the city, which is called Dixie Outlet Mall, what I did 3 separate times, I rode a bike and a friend of mine took the bus, and all 3 times I beat him there. And that's a very long distance trip. That's the north end of the city to the south end of the city. It's a big piece of land. And that's Canada's problem in general, is that almost no cities I can think of in this country have a decent transit system.
Yeah.
You know, Toronto's okay and Montreal's okay, but not incredible.
Yeah.
So how do you move people?
Yeah. But see, a lot of the politicians will say, well, all we have to do is just build better transit. Well, why don't you just stop for a minute, politician, and think? If you were to stabilize your population, that is, not bring in so many immigrants, you would be able to handle the people that you'd be able to manage the roads, that you've got. But if you add more people, you're going to be spending billions on new transit, and if you keep on doing that, you're going to be spending more billions after that, and so on and so on. The thing has to stop somewhere.
Well, it certainly does. I don't think we're going to solve that problem in this conversation. So we're at the end of our time for this episode. Our next episode we're going to cover with Health and Welfare Canada reports.
Right.
Again, this is Dan Murray from immigrationwatchcanada.org. Thank you very much for this, Dan. It was great information.
Yeah, you're welcome, Kevin.
And I'm Kevin J. Johnston, freedomreport.ca.